And now, a word from our sponsor, SpyCloud. Stolen credentials are an open door to your corporate assets. SpyCloud is the world leader in recapturing breach data and making it actionable to prevent cyberattacks. SpyCloud solutions protect your employee's identity and prevent criminals from using employee credentials to commit account takeover, data breaches, BEC, and ransomware attacks. Visit spycloud.com/cyberwire to check your breach exposure now and see how global businesses are using SpyCloud to negate the value of their employees' stolen data. That's spycloud.com/cyberwire. And we thank SpyCloud for sponsoring our show. Someone is phishing for Russian rocketeers. The Port of Houston discloses a cyber attack which the port says it deflected before it had operational consequences. Ransomware gangs are up and active, and the U.S. is considering mandatory reporting by victims as a defensive policy. Pegasus spyware is said to have been found in the phones of 5 French government ministers. Johannes Ullrich from the Sands Technology Institute on attackers hunting for environmental variables. Our guest is Graeme Bunton of the Dns Abuse Institute. And Huawei's Meng Wanzhou may soon be headed home from Vancouver. From the CyberWire studios at Data Tribe, I'm Dave Bittner with your CyberWire summary for Friday, September 24th, 2021. Security firm Malwarebytes reported this week that it had, quote, reason to believe that the MS-HTML vulnerability listed under CVE 2021-40444 is being used to target Russian entities, end quote. The company says its researchers had intercepted email attachments that appear to be used as fish bait to catch Russian organizations. Among the organizations targeted was JSC GREC Makeyev, a company that develops both liquid and solid propellant ballistic missile systems, and that serves as one of Russia's principal rocket and space technology research and development centers. One of the phishing emails directed at Makeyev recipients represented itself as coming from human resources. Other organizations are receiving emails purported to come from the Ministry of the Interior and providing notification that illegal activity has been detected. Whatever the fish bait, the goal of the social engineering appears to be, in the first instance, harvesting of personal information. Malwarebytes has no attribution. As the company observes, however, quote, it is rare that we find evidence of cybercrimes against Russian targets. Given the targets, especially the first one, we suspect that there may be a state-sponsored actor behind these attacks, and we are trying to find out the origin of the attacks. We will keep you informed if we make any progress in that regard, end quote. Microsoft has patched the vulnerability the attackers seek to exploit. The Port of Houston authorities said yesterday in a brief announcement that it had successfully defended itself against a cybersecurity attack in August. Port Houston followed its facilities security plan in doing so, as guided under the Maritime Transportation Security Act, and no operational data or systems were impacted as a result, end quote. CNN reports that on August 19th, attackers believed to be associated with a foreign intelligence service gained access to a server in the Port of Houston, planted malware, and stole Microsoft credentials. Defenders were able to isolate the compromised server within about an hour and a half of the initial attack. Whichever nation-state was responsible for the Houston attack, and there's no attribution yet, the record reports that the attack was accomplished by exploiting a zero-day in a Zoho authentication appliance. A week ago, the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency issued a joint advisory with the FBI and the Coast Guard, warning that CVE 2021-4539, a vulnerability in Zoho's password manager and single sign-on solution Manage Engine AD Self-Service Plus, was being actively exploited in the wild. Zoho had addressed the bug on September 6th, and CISA urged users to apply the patch as soon as possible. The Port of Houston incident would seem to explain both the urgency and of the Coast Guard's involvement in the advisory. Wired notes that the brief dip in the frequency and consequence of ransomware attacks earlier this summer was a false dawn and not an enduring trend. The gangs and the intelligence services that abet them seem simply to have taken time to adjust to Western, mostly U.S. policy and law enforcement tactics, and have returned with, if anything, even greater intensity. Their occultation was no exit and no retirement, and they're back without any sign that they've moderated their appetites. As part of its response to ransomware and other threats to critical infrastructure, the U.S. administration has been pushing for mandatory cyber incident reporting, and the U.S. Congress is considering legislation to that effect. The Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee yesterday held a hearing on cybersecurity and protecting critical infrastructure. Senator Gary Peters, Democrat of Michigan and chair of the committee, asked CISA Director Easterly for her views on an incident reporting bill the senator and his colleagues are working on.
My first question is for Director Easterly. If our incident reporting bill were enacted, what would CISA do with this information, and how would you be able to help victims?
Thanks very much for your question, Chairman. First of all, CISA plays a critical role as the National Coordinator for Critical Infrastructure Resilience and Security. As I think about CISA's superpower that we use on behalf of the nation and the American people is our ability to share information rapidly to enable us to protect other potential victims. So what we could do with this information is not only render assistance to the victim and help them remediate and recover from the attack, but we could use that information, we could analyze it, and then we could share it broadly to see whether, in fact, evidence of such intrusions were found across the sector or, frankly, across other sectors or across the federal civilian executive branch. So we think that timely and relevant reporting of cyber incidents is absolutely critical to help us raise the baseline and protect the cyber ecosystem.
How would such legislation be enforced? Director Easterly wants something other than subpoenas, something more agile, and thinks that some system of fines might be appropriate. National Cyber Director Inglis agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I support that view strongly. I would observe that most of the 50 states have reporting requirements of a similar sort, and the vast majority of those have an enforcement mechanism. Many of those use fines. There may be some best practices in there if we do a thoughtful survey of how they've actually addressed this and how that has worked and whether that has imposed an unfair burden on the victims. We, of course, don't want to impose an unfair burden on the victims, but this information is essential for the welfare of the whole. There should be rewards for good behavior. If you performed well and thoughtfully in this, the benefit should be obvious, which is that we can provide better services, both in response and in preventing this in the future.
The full hearing is available on C-SPAN. Mediapart reports that investigation confirms at least 5 French ministers' phones were infected with Pegasus spyware. Just who instigated the installation of the spyware remains unclear. The Washington Post notes that Mediapart has suggested the government of Morocco was behind the installation, but Morocco, for what it's worth, has both denied involvement and brought a lawsuit against Mediapart, alleging defamation. And finally, Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou will soon be able to leave Vancouver, where she's been fighting extradition to the United States, where she faces charges related to alleged violations of sanctions against Iran. The U.S. Justice Department is said, according to the Wall Street Journal, to have reached a deferred prosecution agreement with her that's expected to be entered today when she appears remotely from Canada before a court in Brooklyn. Quote, "The agreement will require Ms. Meng to admit to some wrongdoing in exchange for prosecutors deferring and later dropping wire and bank fraud charges." End quote. Ms. Meng was arrested in the Vancouver airport in December 2018, Reuters reminds us, on a U.S. warrant alleging bank fraud and wire fraud charges in connection with what the U.S. indictment characterized as misleading a banking partner and financial services partner, HSBC, about Huawei's involvement with Iran. The South China Morning Post characterizes the U.S.'s part in the agreement as dropping the charges. That's not entirely accurate. Under a deferred prosecution agreement, the government brings charges but agrees not to proceed to prosecution, provided the defendant acknowledges responsibility and agrees to certain conditions. If the defendant keeps their side of the bargain, then, after a certain specified period of time, the government drops the charges. In any case, Ms. Meng is likely to be able to return to China shortly after the conclusion of today's virtual hearing. And now, a word from our sponsor, LookingGlass Cyber, a global leader in cybersecurity. In 2021, over 80 significant cyber incidents have taken place, and government entities are struggling to keep up. Cyber attacks harm victims' reputations, increase costs, and erode public trust. We need better security practices. Adaptive security is an approach that treats risk, trust, and security as a continuous and adaptive process that anticipates and mitigates constantly evolving cyber threats. Gartner discusses this concept and how government organizations should leverage adaptive security approaches in its recent report, Top Technology Trends in Government: Adaptive Security. LookingGlass can help your organization develop a continuous approach to monitoring your organization's attack surface and the attack surfaces for all your suppliers and vendors. Get in touch and access your complimentary copy of the Gartner report at lookingglasscyber.com/cyberwire. And we thank Looking Glass Cyber for sponsoring our show. When it comes to attempts to mitigate the actions of bad actors abusing the Internet's domain name system, the DNS, one of the hurdles facing interested parties is how precisely to define DNS abuse. Graeme Bunton is director of the Dns Abuse Institute, where he's leading the charge to try to bring more clarity to this issue.
So the Dns Abuse Institute was created by PIR, who run the .org TLD. They've been operating in the space for a very long time, and they, like I do, see DNS abuse, or this set of online harms, as something like a collective action problem, where registrars and registries would be better served by being more proactive and active on mitigating DNS abuse. But there's a number of disincentives and historical reasons why they haven't been doing so. So the Dns Abuse Institute was created to try and fill that gap. We're going to do that with technology and education and work on collaboration within the industry to try and ultimately reduce DNS abuse.
Well, this article that you all recently published, Dns Abuse Definition, is there an issue with there not being a standard definition of what constitutes DNS abuse?
Unfortunately, yes. At least within the community we operate, the ICANN community and a bit larger than that, there has been sort of endless cycles of debate about what constitutes DNS abuse. It has gone on for years. I can elaborate a little bit here that registrars and registries want a relatively constrained set of harms that they feel capable of understanding and mitigating. And the DNS is like the only centralized bit of the Internet's ecosystem, of the broader infrastructure. And so lots of people have harms that are impacting them, and they want to resolve them. And reasonably, they find themselves at the DNS because that's the only place where they're going to have a real crack at getting them resolved. And so you have these two competing interests trying to define what harms registries and registrars should be responsible for.
Is this partially a matter of fostering collaboration among the interested parties rather than, I could imagine there being quite a bit of finger-pointing?
There is a lot of finger-pointing, and I think what I am trying to do here is really get people to come to the table and say, look, here's the harm, here's how it intersects with the layer of Internet infrastructure that you operate. And you solving it here checks a lot of these boxes. And then you can disagree about specifically which boxes you think are checked. So often within the DNS, we fail on two mitigation attributes. It is often not precise. So the harm might be on it might be on a subdomain or a long URL, not the domain name itself. or it may not be proportional, because most registries and registrars only have the ability to turn off a domain name. And so then we can get into a discussion of specifically what it is that they might disagree on, where they can say, no, I think this harm is proportional to act at the DNS. And that's great, because now it's no longer just do it. We now can say, yes, it's quick and it's efficient, but we're concerned about this proportionality. And so now we can have a more nuanced conversation about the harm and how to mitigate it.
And where are these conversations taking place?
Most of this happens within an ICANN context, so either at ICANN meetings or events surrounding that ecosystem, because that's for the most part where domain names are regulated. Some of this is happening within the broader domain name ecosystem involving ccTLDs as well.
And what do you hope to come out of this? I mean, if people are on board and you get widespread adoption, what will things look like on the other side?
I would love to, first of all, get more people on board for mitigating abuse so that the internet actually gets safer, and then the next piece of this is that if we have a little bit more sophistication in our dialogue, we can understand where we disagree and we agree a bit more, we then can begin to tackle things like, oh boy, this harm should be addressed at the hosting level, but it hasn't been. We have, gone through a rigorous process of trying to do that. Now we can escalate up to the next layer of internet infrastructure, or down to the next layer of internet infrastructure, to the layer of the DNS, and you have some evidence of that process that you've gone through. And now you might have a better case for acting at the layer of the DNS if you've escalated appropriately. But none of those best practices exist yet, and so that's a thing that we'll try and work on next.
That's Graeme Bunton from the Dns Abuse Institute. And now, a word from our sponsor, ExtraHop, stopping advanced threats with network detection and response. Let's face it, cyber attackers have the advantage. ExtraHop is on a mission to help you take it back. Regain the upper hand with security that can't be undermined, outsmarted, or compromised. With complete visibility from ExtraHop, enterprises can detect malicious behavior, hunt advanced threats, and forensically investigate any incident with confidence. When you don't have to choose between protecting your business and moving it forward, that's security uncompromised. See how it works in the full product demo, free online at extrahop.com/cyber. That's extrahop.com/cyber. And we thank ExtraHop for sponsoring our show. And I'm pleased to be joined once again by Johannes Ullrich. He is the Dean of Research at the SANS Technology Institute and also the host of the ISC Stormcast podcast. Johannes, it's always great to have you back. We want to touch today on attackers who are hunting for environmental variables. What can you share with us today?
The root cause of this problem is how, as a developer, are you going to store secrets? And in particular, in modern web applications, you need an awful lot of secrets. You connect to various APIs where you need to provide some kind of access key. You need to connect to a database that may ask you for a username and a password. The one place where you don't want to store these variables is your code. So you have to find another solution. Now, they're very expensive, very elaborate secret managers. Not everybody has those. A very cheap and reasonable, good way of doing this is we just store them in environment variables. Environment variables are not typically sort of directly readable like source code. They don't leak as easily, but where are you storing these environment variables? So we just moved the target a little bit. Mm-hmm. And what a lot of developers apparently are doing is they're storing these environment variables in a file, and then they place the file in the document root of your web server. The document root is the directory where, by default, your files are being retrieved from. So now it's really just a matter of an attacker guessing the right file name, pointing it to or looking for that file on your web server, and they have all your secrets. Add to that developers aren't really all that inventive when it comes to these file names. We do see a lot of requests for very common names like .env and or just env, so short for environment. And lately also a lot for Twilio.env, where Twilio is a service that allows you to send SMS messages, make phone calls and such. A lot of websites use that to integrate with voice and text messaging.
And so what's the solution here? I mean, is it as simple as putting this stuff in a protected directory?
Yeah, that's the first step. Put it outside the document root. That way, an attacker using that very simple attack is not able to access it. Of course, the real solution is use a proper secret manager. As I said, this can be a little bit complex. It's very specific on particular language environment that you're using. So, for example, if you're looking at the Twilio documentation, they have an example how to store the secrets as environment variable. That's sort of what they recommend. The reason why they recommend it is because it pretty much works for everybody. While any more sophisticated solution is very specific to the language and the overall environment that you're using.
All right. Well, interesting stuff. Johannes Ullrich, thanks for joining us. Thanks to all of our sponsors for making the CyberWire possible, especially our supporting sponsor, Sumo Logic. Ready to master your data? Register for Sumo Logic's virtual Illuminate user conference September 28th through the 29th. Learn more at sumologic.com/illuminate. And that's the CyberWire. For links to all of today's stories, check out our daily briefing at thecyberwire.com. The CyberWire podcast is proudly produced in Maryland out of the startup studios of Data Tribe, where they're co-building the next generation of cybersecurity teams and technologies. Looking for something to do this weekend? Well, be sure to check out this week's Research Saturday and my conversation with Ariel Zelavansky from Palo Alto Networks. We're discussing their work titled What You Need to Know About Azurescape. That's Research Saturday. Do check it out. Our amazing CyberWire team is Elliot Peltzman, Trey Hester, Brandon Karp, Paru Prakash, Justin Savy, Tim Nodar, Joe Kerrigan, Carol Terrio, Ben Yellen, Nick Valecki, Gina Johnson, Bennett Moe, Chris Russell, John Petrick, Jennifer Iben, Rick Howard, Peter Kilpie, and I'm Dave Bittner. Thanks for listening. We'll see you back here next week. What's the true impact of insider risk? Did you know that according to Aberdeen Research, 1 in 3 organizations reported data breaches involving insiders, and that 80% of those were not malicious, but were caused by negligence or by accident? Did you know that the average number of data exposure events is 13 events per user per day? Breaches are 4.5 times more likely to happen on an endpoint than on a server and can cost an organization up to 20% of its annual revenue. Insider risk has a huge impact on the business, making it a top cybersecurity priority that is only predicted to grow. Transform your approach to managing insider risk with Code 42. Code 42 believes that organizations should never compromise their speed of innovation or the safety of their data. That's why the Code 42 insider risk management approach fundamentally shifts the data security mindset to focus on results that deliver business value. For resources on insider risk management, visit code42.com/showme.